Hello, everyone. I hope you all are safe and well. I'd like to welcome you to our program today, SolarWinds and the Art of Cyberwar. We're pleased to have joining us two veteran correspondents from the New York Times, David Sanger and Nicole Roth. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Philip Yun, President and CEO of World Affairs, and I'm particularly delighted to open today's program because it's the first in a 2021 speaker series that is being presented jointly by World Affairs and the Pacific Council on International Policy. World Affairs is particularly proud to formally partner with the Pacific Council because both organizations, World Affairs, which is based here in San Francisco, and the Pacific Council, which is in LA, covers all of what our governor, Gavin Newsom, has called the nation state of California. This because of California's economic and political clout. So together, World Affairs and the Pacific Council offer what we believe is a unique West Coast platform and a sensibility for our expert speakers and our newsmakers. So I am delighted to be joined by Natasha Everhart, who's the Director of Strategy at the Pacific Council. We'll take it from here. Thank you, everyone. Natasha, go ahead.
All right, thanks, Philip. My name is Natasha Everhart. I am the Director of Strategy at the Pacific Council. It's great to be here with you all today to launch our shared series together. As a leading international policy organization in Los Angeles, it makes sense for us to partner with World Affairs based in Northern California to bring our audiences together and to learn from global experts and thought leaders such as David Sanger and Nicole Roth. For those of you who are not members of the Pacific Council, we promote global engagement in Los Angeles and California, and we build the capacity of LA and California for impact on global issues, discourse, and policy. As Philip mentioned, we hope to do so across the West Coast, in the nation state of California. Our members are leaders in business, the public sector, academia, and beyond. We're committed to representing diverse perspectives and voices to contribute to international policy outcomes. Please visit pacificcouncil.org to learn more if you're interested. And now I'm delighted to introduce our guest speakers today, David Sanger and Nicole Roth. David E. Sanger is a national security correspondent and senior writer for the New York Times. He's a best-selling author of The Perfect Weapon, The Inheritance, and Confront and Conceal. He's been a member of 3 teams that won the Pulitzer Prize, including in 2017 for international reporting. A regular contributor to CNN, he also teaches national security policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Nicole Roth, on the other hand, is an award-winning cybersecurity journalist for the New York Times, where her work has been optioned for both film and television. She's a regular lecturer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and a graduate of Princeton University and Stanford University. In preparation for the conversation today, I hope you were all able to watch the HBO documentary, The Perfect Weapon, which is based on David Sanger's most recent book. You can also purchase Nicole's new book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, which was just published this last week. And now to tell us what we know and, importantly, what we don't know about SolarWinds, cyber espionage, and cyber warfare, I'm going to turn this over to the experts, Nicole and David.
Thank you so much for having us. It looks like David's having some connectivity issues, so I'll take it away. Thank you, and thank you to everyone who is hosting and joining us today. I know Zoom calls are a big ask these days, but I'm delighted to join you to talk about SolarWinds and the status of global cyber warfare. So David and I have been covering SolarWinds for the New York Times for a few months now. I think it has been a huge challenge to try to not overhype this attack, because in the end, we're learning every day it does seem designed for espionage, for the theft of sensitive government emails and strategy planning documents. On the other hand, this appears to be one of the most pervasive cyber attacks we have faced in a long, long time, if not ever. It also is a huge counterintelligence failure on the part of the United States, because we did not discover this attack inside our government networks on our own. We were tipped off to this attack by a security company based in Silicon Valley, FireEye, which discovered a hack of its own systems. And then in the course of rewinding that attack, learned that cyber criminals or nation states, we suspect Russia, broke in through a Texas IT company called SolarWinds, hence the name of the attack. They used that company to compromise its software updates. And from there, they got into the Department of Energy, its nuclear labs, the Treasury, Commerce, the State Department, the Justice Department, and the Department of Homeland Security, the very agency charged with keeping us safe. And it seems that every week we learn of new victims of this attack. We know Microsoft was compromised. We know that CrowdStrike was trying to, was unsuccessfully targeted. And we are learning of new technology companies that were used in the course of this attack. The thing about it is that it is going to be very difficult for this new administration to calibrate a response. For the first part, how do you respond to an attack that you yourselves have done successfully for decades? David and I have covered numerous cyber attacks that the US has done on other countries, including a very similar attack that the NSA pulled off on Huawei, the Chinese software and hardware supplier, in which we broke into Huawei systems initially to look for Chinese PLA backdoors. But once we were in, we learned that we could use Huawei to spy on adversaries that did not use the software that Americans used. And so we did that. We used Huawei's software as a conduit to spy on countries like North Korea and China and Sudan and Syria. And the other thing about this attack that makes the response very difficult is the actor. Right now, the leading suspect is a unit of the Russian intelligence agency, the SVR, that we know very well because in 2014, 2015, both David and I covered attacks by the SVR on the State Department and on the White House. And what we both learned from talking to sources involved in those attacks, and particularly those on the ground remediating that attack, was that getting those hackers out of our government networks was the equivalent to what they said was hand-to-hand digital combat. It was one of the hardest adversaries to eradicate from those systems. At one point, the hackers even took over investigators' tools and manipulated them so they would not catch backdoors in the government system. So that is the adversary we believe we are up against right now. And it could be years, if not months, before we can confidently say that we have eradicated these hackers from our systems. The other thing that makes it difficult is how do you respond to an attack when you don't know whether the adversary is out of your systems? This group, we have not seen this kind of behavior from. They are primarily focused on espionage, but other Russian groups, if it is indeed Russia, have used these same access points to, in some cases, paralyze IT systems with ransomware. In others, we know that in Ukraine, Russia has literally turned off the lights in the dead of winter. And if you're watching what's happening in Texas right now, then you know exactly what that would look like here. So this will be a very difficult attack to respond to. Is David back on?
I think I am. Can you hear me?
Oh, good. There you are. Okay.
Sorry about
so I'm
that.
Gonna let,
I'm assuming
okay.
I'm assuming here for a minute that it was the Russians or it's the or it's Vermont internet, one of the two. So my apology for dropping out. And I was going to give this wonderful introduction to Nicole's book, which made it onto the bestseller list yesterday. But if you're an employee of the New York Times, you have no control over what goes on the bestseller list, but it very much deserved it. It's really a terrific read. And it sounds to me from when I was able to reconnect as if Nicole sort of given the background of how we got here on SolarWinds.
I gave the lay of the land, but David, you could maybe start by telling us what happened at the White House briefing on the SolarWinds attack yesterday.
So one of the interesting things about the Biden administration is that they're willing to discuss SolarWinds as an attack, in part because it didn't happen on their watch. it happened on the Trump administration watch. And for those who, and by the way, I'm not blaming President Trump for that. All those hacks that Nicole was discussing before, and of course, Sony and the Office of Personnel Management, all that happened on Obama's watch and Obama-Biden. What is interesting, though, is that President Trump, in his one comment on SolarWinds, tried to say, well, maybe it was the Chinese. And then immediately the intelligence community came out and said, no, it wasn't the Chinese. In fact, it was likely the Russians, which is exactly where the White House left it yesterday. They didn't take the attribution any further. They haven't pushed it any further. They did say that there were 9 government agencies that were hit. They have not done a final count of how many corporations were hit. What's really interesting about this attack, I find, is 2 things. First, the Russians knew better than to attack us from Russia. In fact, to evade US intelligence, they came and engineered the entire thing from the United States. SolarWinds is a Texas company, and they got into the software that does the update. And for those of you who are wondering about what that means, just remember that, you know, your cell phone updates at night, right? You put it in and you put it next to your bed, and overnight you see that some new version of the operating system has been loaded in. And unless you're Nicole, you probably don't check every line of the code that came into your phone to make sure that it didn't introduce new malware into your phone. I would bet even Nicole doesn't do that in the morning. So the Russians did that. And then once SolarWinds loaded their software into the computer networks of companies across America and government agencies, including the New York Times, which use SolarWinds software, then they were in those companies without going through your passwords, without trying to go break into the system. SolarWinds would take it into the system because SolarWinds software was network management software. So that was the brilliance of this thing. And then it beamed out to a command and control center, not back in Russia, but command and control centers that Amazon and GoDaddy ran in the United States. So at the White House briefing, Ann Neuberger, formerly of the National Security Agency, now the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber, a new position in the White House, said that they were going to have to basically redo their systems to account for the fact that the US intelligence community is not allowed to look inside the United States for all kinds of good personal privacy reasons. Our intelligence community can only look outside. And what happened was, in this case, was that the Russians knew this, turned our own privacy laws against us, and operated completely from inside the US, which gives you an idea what a new kind of problem we're facing.
The other thing I would just say, and just listening to that remark, David, is we are definitely in a game of chess with Russia, if indeed this is Russia, and they have our number. You know, when you covered the 2016 election attacks, what always struck me about that is the intelligence even showed Russia wasn't even, it blew Russia's minds how successful that attack and those information and disinformation campaigns were. They got our sweet spot by tapping into America's polarization and divisions. And now, once again, they've gotten into our sweet spot by brilliantly exploiting the seams in our defenses and our own privacy protections. So how do you respond to an attack like this? And also deterrence. I mean, we are finding out every day with this attack just how failed our deterrence strategies have been. We've tried sanctions, we've tried indictments. David and I both covered attacks by Cyber Command on the Russian grid. Perhaps deterrence shifted the Russian priorities away from our election, but they are now inside our federal IT network. So to me, it seems the most interesting conversations inside this new administration right now will be, how do you deter future attacks like this? And I don't think there will be any easy answers.
There is a fascinating debate underway in Washington right now about whether this was all an example of deterrence failing. And it may well have been a failure of deterrence, because what happened in this case was that the entire United States infrastructure was focused on the election. And instead, what happened in this case is that the Russians said, well, if they're all focusing on the election, let us go focus on something short of the election, right? It's not a different part of the system. And so we were congratulating ourselves for the fact that the Russians didn't do much in the 2020 election. And it turned out they had just turned their attentions elsewhere, which gets to a big issue that's all through Nicole's wonderful book, which is that the Russians have figured out here how to go do the computer engineering, the social engineering, as she was saying, and the legal engineering. That is to say, go and operate in ways that they know the NSA cannot follow you. But what's really fascinating about watching all of this unfold is that the history here is really long. I mean, the Russians are not new to our networks. They were the first ones to come in and get into the Defense Department networks in the mid-1990s in a series of incidents that really led to the creation of what is the modern Cyber Command. And then as time went on, the United States began harvesting what are called zero-day flaws, which is to say flaws in computer systems that have never been seen before. And they're 0 days because you have 0 days of warning to go after them. And Nicole, that's really what your book does so well, is take us into this world and this market of 0 days and the people who market them. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how it is that this has turned into such a wild market for these vulnerabilities.
Thank you. So I think one of the things I wanted to explore in this book was incentive structures, because it appeared to me with all of the attacks David and I were covering for the New York Times, that consistently the incentive structures were leading to more vulnerability. They were never leading to more security. And one of the most tangible forms of this was what I saw was a 0 day market. So as David mentioned, starting in the 90s, the United States, along with a few of our allies, started harvesting 0 days, these flaws in code. And just to back up for a minute, the simplest example or explanation for a 0 day is, if I, a hacker, find a flaw in your iPhone iOS software, and I can develop code to exploit it, I could potentially use that 0 day exploit to read your text messages, to capture the audio off your phone, to turn on your camera and capture your surroundings. And that capability, particularly as companies like Apple have increased their security and the encryption around their products, that capability has taken on real world espionage value and surveillance value. So the United States in the 90s started harvesting these 0 days. And back then, if we found a 0 day in Huawei software or in a computer that was really only used in Russia and foreign markets, then we would keep it and we would use it to spy on the Chinese, North Korea, Russia, people working at the Russian embassy in Kiev. No harm, no foul. The problem is, over the past 2 decades, we've all migrated to using the same technology. We all use iPhones and Androids, and whether you know it or not, Microsoft Windows and Cisco routers and switches. So when we found vulnerabilities in those systems, we were also keeping that knowledge to ourselves so we could use it for our own espionage programs, but also increasingly battlefield preparations. As David documented so well in his books, we used a string of 7 0 days, these vulnerabilities in Microsoft Windows systems and Siemens software, which makes its way into nuclear plants and power plants and factories all over the world, but primarily in the United States. We used those holes to pull off the most stunning cyber attack of all time, We used it to dismantle centrifuges at Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. And that attack was a brilliant success. It kept the Israeli jets on the ground when Israel was threatening to bomb Natanz. It kept us from triggering a third war in the Middle East when we were already overstretched. And arguably, some say it got Tehran to the negotiating table when it came time to negotiate the Iran nuclear deal. The problem, and this is really one of my favorite parts of the documentary, the Perfect Weapon documentary, is it got out. And that's the thing about cyber attacks. They usually get out. And when it got out, it really showed the world not just the espionage value of zero-day exploits and code, but the potential for destruction, for destroying an adversary's nuclear uranium centrifuges and fissile material. And since then, since that attack got out in 2010, every other government on the planet, maybe with the exception of Antarctica, has started stockpiling their own 0 days in this software. And the problem is when you stockpile a 0 day, you are keeping that information from the software and hardware manufacturers. Apple won't have a chance to patch it until it knows about it. And we're not telling the manufacturers because as soon as we tell these manufacturers, the 0 day essentially loses its value and turns to dust. So for a long time, we've learned that there are these serious deliberations within the US government and in the UK, and increasingly a few other governments like Australia and Canada have entertained these discussions, and we've heard that maybe Germany has as well. They call it the Vulnerabilities Equities Process, the VEP process. And essentially what it is a bunch of representatives from different agencies like the NSA, the Department of Homeland Security, and other agencies that have a stake in this, sit around a table and debate the merits of whether to keep or turn over a 0 day. And we were told that among the criteria that's considered in those discussions is how serious the vulnerability is, how widely used the software is that flaw is in, whether it would impact the relationship between Silicon Valley and government if it was known that the government hoarded this information, and also what the damage to the United States would be if that 0 day got out. And for a while, when I interviewed people involved in this process, they would readily admit that it was more art than science. And as Michael Daniel put it to me, when I interviewed him about this, he was then the White House cybersecurity coordinator, position that was eradicated under Trump. He said, listen, Nicole, sometimes blood is left on the table. These discussions are not neat. I have regrets. And in 2017, we saw exactly what he meant, because someone, we still don't know who they were, appeared on Twitter calling themselves the shadow brokers, dumped over a period of many months some of the NSA's best kept 0 day exploits online. And sure enough, North Korea picked them up to ransomware systems all over the world. Most famously, British hospitals had to turn patients away because their IT networks and some of their medical equipment was locked up. And then a month later, Russia used the NSA's tools in an attack on Ukraine that, just like the Stuxnet attack on Natanz, got out. And it didn't just hit Ukraine, it hit any business or company or government agency that had anyone working remotely from Ukraine. So it hit Pfizer, it hit FedEx, it cost $400 million to FedEx, Merck. It disrupted Merck's vaccine supplies. Merck had to tap into the CDC's emergency supplies of Gardasil vaccine that year. So I don't have to tell you how bad an attack like that would be right now on Pfizer or Moderna. But what it showed us when we dug into that toolkit that was used, we found out that this was a flaw in Microsoft Windows software, probably the most widely used software in the world, that makes its way into our own critical infrastructure, that the NSA held on to it for more than 5 years. And for legitimate purposes, they told me that this was getting some of the best counterintelligence that they got at the agency, such good intelligence that it was never seriously up for consideration that they would turn this over to Microsoft. But clearly we saw what happened when that flaw was discovered and used against us. And that is where we are today, as our capabilities, the ones that we had such a big lead in deploying and developing ourselves, we no longer have that gap of capabilities. That gap is closing. And these attacks and capabilities are now being turned on us.
If you sort of just go up 30,000 feet from Nicole's very good description of all of this, and think of this in the historic terms of what's happened in past arms races that the United States has been involved in, I would say there are a couple of similarities and many, many major differences here. So the first is the obvious one. People tend, usually wrongly, to do nuclear analogies with cyber, and it doesn't really work. But the one area where it does work is that we thought, starting in 1945, that we had a huge lead over the rest of the world in nuclear weapons. And actually in the late 40s, Harry Truman had a memo on his desk saying that the Soviets were at least a year away from a nuclear weapon, and they tested the weekend that he got the memo. So it told you that we really had underassessed how much progress they'd made. Here we are, 75, nearly 76 years after Hiroshima, and only 9 countries have nuclear weapons capability right now. It's actually a smaller number than Kennedy and others suspected would. But when I was finishing up Confront and Conceal 2 years ago, The Perfect Weapon 2 years ago, I think we counted about 35 nations that had the ability to do a sophisticated cyber attack on the United States. And that's because, unlike nuclear, this is much more widely available. It's available not just to governments, but to terror groups, to criminal groups, and it's criminal groups that have used 0 days and other things to do ransomware and so forth. It's available to teenagers, and we all know how dangerous they are. That tells you that all of the usual ways that we had to deter attacks in the nuclear age simply don't apply to what Nicole just described. There's also one knowledge gap. Even during the Obama administration, a pretty tech-savvy administration, it astounded government officials who were trained, as I was, in traditional conflict between nations and traditional arms, that this whole market existed, that you could be a small power like North Korea or Iran, or a larger one like Russia and China, and use this as a short of war weapon that could degrade the power of the United States, and yet calibrate it in a way that it does not lead to a military conflict. This is a short of war weapon. If we broke out into open war, sure, there would be cyber as a big piece of it, but used every day, it's short of war. And that's why it's so much more useful than nuclear weapons. Think, if you've got nuclear weapons, you can't really use them because you know what will happen an hour later. But if you have cyber weapons, you have a pretty high confidence that if you moderate your attack and calibrate it just right, you're probably going to pay a very small price, if any price at all. And that's the SolarWinds dilemma. If they were just spying on us, if they were just stealing emails and so forth, well, we do that too. If they were putting in backdoors because they want to go attack us, well, as Nicole has just described, we basically did a supply chain attack to get after the Natanz nuclear enrichment site. We've done supply chain attacks to make North Korean missiles blow up. We've done supply chain attacks to slow down the Iranian missile program. And so setting some global rules here would require us to basically agree that we too are not going to be using some of these weapons. And that's not really where Cybercom or the National Security Agency is right now, because they want to give a president of the United States, whoever the president is, as many options as they possibly can. And if they could go into the president and say, hey, we can use a few 0 days of the kind that Nicole describes in her book to turn off the power in Tehran, well, then maybe we won't have to bomb Tehran. And wouldn't that be a significant improvement over causing the kind of casualties that you would if you had to level an entire city? That doesn't mean you wouldn't have any casualties. You turn off the electricity, people are going to die in nursing homes and hospitals and people shut into their homes, but probably not on the scale at which they would in a traditional military campaign. So Nicole, where's this headed? If the Biden administration called you in and said, we all just read your book and we understand we've got a huge problem here, but what is it that you would do both on the offense and the defense side to make us more secure? What would that combo look like?
Well, I think we have exhausted some of our offensive options here. We have already used cyber to enshrine critical infrastructure as a legitimate target. We have been hacking into the Russian grid, as you and I disclosed to the New York Times readers a few years ago. We have been hacking the Russian grid, and we have been making a loud show of it as a sign to Russia to say, hey, if you're going to hack into our grid and our nuclear plants, know that we have also hacked into yours. And if you turn the lights off here, we will turn the lights off there. And then in terms of diplomacy, I've already said, we've somewhat exhausted our options here. Sanctions, indictments, naming and shaming has not stopped Russia or Iran or North Korea or China from resuming their cyber attacks on the United States. We are in a very precarious position right now. Everything that could be intercepted in the United States has been. Our personal data, our intellectual property, our power plants, our nuclear plants, our hospitals are being held ransom almost every other week by cyber criminals, many of them in Russia. So what do we do here? And this idea that we're going to come up with international norms is a very interesting, nuanced conversation because, as David mentioned, we don't want to handcuff ourselves. Also, most of the cyber attacks that come out of the United States come out of Cyber Command, and the espionage operations come out of NSA. We don't have the luxury here of tapping a Google engineer on the shoulder at night and saying, hey, you're coming with us tonight. We direct our own cyber attacks. That is not the case in Russia and China and Iran. In Iran, we know from indictments that they rely on a satellite system of contractors these days to pull off a lot of their attacks. In China, some of the most sophisticated attacks no longer come from the PLA anymore. A few years ago, David and I revealed the unit known as 61398, who was working out of Shanghai and conducting thousands of attacks on US companies and think tanks and diplomats. But these days, most of the sophisticated attacks out of China don't come from the PLA or even the Ministry of State Security anymore. They come from this satellite network of contractors. And in Russia, it's a little different, but similar. There is some call it a pax mafiosa between the FSB, the Soviet intelligence, and Russian cyber criminals. They say, Putin has only two rules for his cyber criminals: don't hack inside the motherland. And when we call in a favor, you do what we ask. And we saw this in indictment form in the Yahoo attack a few years ago. When they finally named who was behind that attack, it was two Russian cyber criminals who broke in and profited off of a lot of the data and passwords they were stealing. And then it was two FSB agents who said, if you find a really interesting account that belongs to a White House staffer, pass that over to us. And so what these countries have that we don't have is a larger degree of plausible deniability, because even if Putin agreed to cease attacks on our critical infrastructure, if a Russian cyber criminal hacked into our critical infrastructure and we tied it back to that cyber criminal, Putin could just as easily say, that wasn't us. Or as he put it a couple of years ago, he said, Russian hackers are like artists. They just wake up in the morning and start painting. So, we're really at a disadvantage here when it comes to international norms. So where I chose to focus in my book is on defense. What can we do at the individual level, at business level, government level to lock down our systems? And unfortunately, offense has always been more fun than defense. Defense is grueling. It's boring. It requires things like two-factor authentication and using a password manager and not clicking on links. And at businesses, it requires slowing down, getting your product to market and making sure that all the code is locked up So you're not rolling out vulnerable code riddled with 0 days to Teslas and critical infrastructure and our personal data and iPhone and Android systems. And at the government level, it means knowing what's in our systems, knowing what's touching our network. In the case of SolarWinds, when David and I spoke to a lot of the victims, some didn't even know they were using SolarWinds software, and they definitely didn't know that most of SolarWinds software is now built abroad in places like Belarus, Europe's last dictatorship. So it really starts with taking stock of the software we're using, what systems we're rolling it into, where it's made, how seriously they take security. And it's not exciting, it's not sexy, it's really grueling. But for too long, we have ignored that we are woefully behind on defense. We believed this philosophy that if we were good on offense, if we could hack into enemy systems, that we could set up an early alert system for knowing what the enemy had planned. And what SolarWinds has exposed is that that was always a lie. We didn't detect the SolarWinds attack on our system. It was FireEye that detected it and notified government and Microsoft that we were all hacked. So this idea that offense is going to keep us safe was always a fallacy. And now I would argue, what the Biden administration has to do is refocus on defense. It's not to say stop all the offensive attacks, but just if we're going to attack these foreign systems, you can't do it without realizing that we are the most vulnerable targeted nation on earth now because we're so wired and because we have systems that are most of interest to cyber criminals and nation states.
So, Nicole's last point there is, I think, one of the most important. Michael Solmeyer, who ran the Harvard cyber program, is now working at the White House in the new Biden administration, had this great line a few years ago, which is, we live in the glassiest of the glass houses. So if you're a country that has relatively low internet penetration, like North Korea, and then you look at the United States, you see a country that's like nothing but target space, right? You can throw those rocks through all those glass windows, and we can't throw similar rocks back. We may have other ways to go deal with them, but not that way. Nicole, we have some questions coming in from the audience now, and for those of you who want to add to that list, go to the Q&A function on your Zoom page. You'll be able to do it. We have two that are in right now. The first one, which maybe I'll take, Nicole, and I'll give you the second, is at what point does a cyber attack deserve to be treated as an act of war? What kind of response would be appropriate and effective? Well, Nicole was discussing the responses there, but this first question of what kind of cyber attack is an act of war is one that is very much debated, not only in the US government, but every one of the military academies now has a cyber center, and this is sort of a central question for them. One way that I divide this up, and you see this in the documentary of The Perfect Weapon, is to think about the purposes of the attack. So some are just about espionage. And right now, SolarWinds, the only evidence we have is espionage. Espionage is not an act of war. Espionage is what we all do in peacetime. The United States does, our adversaries do. So I would take that off the table as an act of war. Then there is data manipulation. Now, that doesn't mean that I go into the Pentagon and redirect all of their missiles. I might simply get into the Pentagon and change the blood type of every soldier and sailor in the medical system. Terrifying thought, but not necessarily one that would constitute a traditional act of war, but it is certainly an act of sabotage. It's worth asking the question, was the attack on the Natanz nuclear enrichment plant an act of war? We said, no, we were simply deterring them from building a nuclear weapon. If you're on the receiving end of it for the Iranians, it sure looks like an act of war. Somebody came into your country with code and blew up what they called their civilian facilities and what we called their military facilities. Was the Sony attack an act of war? Here you had the North Korean dictator, Kim Jong-un, going after Sony because they were turning out a movie, a really terrible movie, that was a comedy that purported to be a couple of journalists going off to interview Kim and hired by the CIA to assassinate him on the way out. The North Koreans considered the movie to be a hostile act, they said, and they thought that the hack back into Sony was a proportionate hostile act. But they made 70% of Sony's Sony Pictures Entertainment's computer systems melt down. If they had gone in not with cyber, but with dynamite and blown up the computer center at Sony Pictures, we would have sent some kind of aircraft over North Korea to make something blow up in Pyongyang. So an act that done with a kinetic weapon might seem like an act of war, may seem less an act of war when done with cyber, or at least that's the way people have been acting so far. And then the final version of it is influence operations. Was it an act of war when the Russians came in and pretended to be Nicole's neighbor, and were putting out Facebook posts trying to get people to show up at protests? Many people would not think that is an act of war. It is instead a psychological operation. But you heard a lot of people on Capitol Hill running around saying act of war, act of war. And so every time you hear that, you've kind of got to stop and ask the question, is it really? And we got another question, Nicole, which I'm going to ask you to answer. Given that there are no quick fixes to state-sanctioned hacking, how do we come up with a long-term strategy that works? See, I gave you the hardest question here. And who are the stakeholders that would need to come together in that? And I think you suggested that a little bit in your answer before. But.
Yeah, I think I tried to address this in the last one. It's a really hard question. How do we deter nation state attacks on our systems? And it's really interesting, and the documentary, the Perfect Weapon documentary, really gets into this. What our adversaries have figured out is they don't need to go hack the Pentagon. They can cause us a lot of damage if they go after our economy. We've seen Iran pull off denial of service attacks on American banks so people can access their online banking systems. We saw them destroy networks at Sands Casino when Sheldon Adelson suggested that we bomb Tehran or Iran's nuclear facilities. We've seen them now inside our government networks in this espionage campaign that, like David pointed out, we do ourselves. So how do you respond to these attacks? When do they rise to a level of war? And I don't think there are any easy solutions, which is why I think the smartest thing we can do is make sure that our systems are ready and resilient for nation state attacks. And unfortunately, there too, we're at a disadvantage because 80% of critical infrastructure in the United States is owned by the private sector. And after Snowden in particular, we don't want to invite the NSA into private sector networks. That's the last thing companies like Google want, especially when they have to answer to so many foreign customers. So what do you do? Well, some of the things that have been tried are under Obama, there was an attempt to pass legislation that had real teeth that would mandate that the private companies that run our critical infrastructure would have tip-top security. And unfortunately, that was lobbied pretty aggressively by the US Chamber of Commerce, which said, no, that would be too burdensome on these companies. Also, fun fact, while the US Chamber of Commerce was lobbying against this legislation, they themselves were hacked in one of my favorite attacks of all time by China. And it's my favorite attack because the FBI came in, they thought they'd eradicated the Chinese from their systems. And then 3 months later, one of their corporate apartments in DC the thermostat was acting a little funny. And when they went and did some forensics on it, they realized that the thermostat had been communicating with an IP address in China. So that was, several years ago. What legislation has come down, and it hasn't been legislation, it's been in the form of an executive order, came from Obama and then from Trump, that identified which of these systems counted as critical infrastructure and set voluntary standards for these companies to meet security. I would say now it has gotten to a point where the cost of doing nothing in terms of our securing these systems is much higher than the cost to these businesses of doing something. And I think we need to look at this from an incentive standpoint. We need to perhaps roll out tax credits for companies that are willing to submit themselves to advanced penetration tests, that we can certify don't use old, outdated, tangled networks of software that can't be patched. We should incentivize companies to turn on two-factor authentication, et cetera, and we're just not there yet. And then I think there should be penalties for companies that found that the security is lacking. But the problem is, and we really saw this the other week in Florida, when a small water treatment facility in Oldsmar, Florida, population 15,000, was hijacked by hackers. We don't know who they are. They could be teenagers or a disgruntled employee, or I've been joking that since this was the Friday before the Super Bowl in Tampa, that it was some bitter Patriots fan, hacked into these systems and increased the level of lye in the water, LYE, from 100 parts per million to 11,000 parts per million. That could have badly sickened that population had an engineer not been sitting at his desk and watched as his mouse cursor moved around, and then a couple hours later got into the chemical functions that control the level of lye in the water. We don't know how they got in, but the leading suspect for that is a phishing attack, or that they didn't have two-factor authentication turned on, or that they were using outdated software. So we would come a long way if we just mandated that even these small municipal water treatment facilities had basic security in place so the enemy wouldn't see so many targets of opportunity here. But I'll leave that one there.
Well, Nicole, that leads us right into the next question that we've been asked. But I just wanted to add to that in coming weeks, we're expecting to see President Biden issue an executive order on supply chains, not just software supply chains, but all kinds of vulnerable supply chains. Semiconductors is a classic example right now, where a lot of auto companies are running short of semiconductors because we're overly dependent on Taiwan Semiconductor at this point, a single company in Taiwan, which, by the way, also makes the 5G chips for China. So you can imagine the power struggle over that. And we need to move more of that production here. But the software supply chain you've seen. The question we got here was, to avoid the glass house problem, can you see the government affording protection to private citizens and corporations, as was once proposed with the Clipper chip? We'll get back to the Clipper chip in a moment, because that was a huge failure. Nicole can explain better than I. Yes, you could see the government affording protection, but the question is at what level? So do the comparison to your own house, right? So you have locks on the door, and you might have an alarm system, and that's to get rid of like 85% of the street crime that goes by the house. Or in Nicole's case, to protect against the bear who was wandering outside her house the other day. And we don't expect the government to come protect us against every single thing. There's some basic precautions we need to take. But you don't expect your alarm system to help you against a nuclear attack from North Korea. And for that, you're counting on the government to go do the protection. And the question here is, if we all believe that we deserve ourselves to have to go do the basic cyber hygiene to protect our systems, at what point do we say, look, there's no way I can protect my system against a Russian or a Chinese or an Iranian hack? There, the government's got to step in. And knowing where that dividing line is very difficult. It was a huge debate in the Obama White House during the Sony case. Was this an act of war, like some said? Obama said, are you kidding me? This was a Seth Rogen movie, we've got to figure out ourselves where that line stands. And that's the problem, because once you rely on the government to do all of your protection, you've disincentivized companies and individuals to be responsible for their own protection. And Nicole, we got a second one here, which is, what are the implications of cyber-related economic espionage as well? And that is something we've seen for a long time.
So I think, the impact of cyber-related espionage is this. 2 decades ago, like I mentioned, we were all using different software. So if we found a flaw in Huawei, we left it open for our own espionage programs. These days, we have to make a very different calculation, which is if we find a flaw in Microsoft Windows, are we going to use that to track a terrorist network? Even if it means leaving American systems open to attack. One of the most glaring examples I remember was after the Stuxnet attack on the Natanz nuclear facility. One of the first people, the first person I think actually, to pin this back on the US and Israel was Ralph Langner. He's a German industrial control specialist, and he gave this great talk at the TED conference that year. And what he said was, if you do a target map, if you looked at a map of the entire world and looked at where these Microsoft Windows and Siemens systems were, the bulk of them are not in the Middle East or even China. They're in Japan, they're in the United States. So we basically just opened up Pandora's box by hacking into these systems, and we showed the world how to do it. And the United States is the most vulnerable to these attacks. And so, the byproduct of hoarding these vulnerabilities in the software to preserve our espionage advantage is that we are also leaving Americans vulnerable. And that's no longer a hypothetical anymore, because as David and I have covered in weekly stories in the New York Times now, we are the most frequent target of cyber attacks now. American businesses and infrastructure are the most frequent target of cyber attacks. This was shocking to me, this detail. 10 years ago, when I started at the New York Times, basically my life was consumed with Chinese cyber espionage attacks. We were getting attacked at all hours of the day with sloppy spear phishing emails. Our intellectual property was walking out the door. Last year, when I talked to security researchers, China was no longer the most frequent culprit for cyber attacks on the United States. It had shifted to Iran. Iran emerged from this digital backwater into one of the most prolific adversaries we now face in cyberspace. They are also after intellectual property now. They break into our telecoms and internet service providers with very stealthy, efficient attacks. And they are one of the biggest targeters of our critical infrastructure. So that is essentially what the fallout has been from our own espionage programs. We showed our targets like Iran what could be done. And now these capabilities and attacks have boomeranged back on us. And that's why I think our only choice now is to seriously reprioritize our collective defense.
So Nicole, we've got a couple of other good questions and only a little less than 10 minutes. So we'll try to wrap through them pretty quickly. A really interesting one that came in that said, what is the role of data localization, keeping data stored in the country where it's used in terms of cybersecurity? And the answer to that, in my view, and Nicole, we have never discussed this, so I'd be interested to know if you have a different one, is not much. That, if the data is in the cloud, we're keeping it local, probably to have some degree of control over being able to get in to investigate it. So let me give you an example. Microsoft got a few years ago, got a subpoena involving a drug case in which they were being asked for the emails of a suspect in a fairly routine drug case. And they sent it back to the US government and they said, this data is actually kept in Ireland because this person is a European and we try to keep them closer to it. Would you simply go to the Irish courts and try to get it from the server in Ireland? We can't give it to you. Went all the way to the Supreme Court. Ultimately, Microsoft lost. And the ruling was if Microsoft's got the data, it doesn't make any difference where they choose in the world to go store it. They have to give it to the US government. Well, seems to make some sense, except when you turn it around. So we're worried about the Chinese who want their data to be local so that they can go into it with very little legal process or not something we would consider an independent judiciary to go find dissidents and then hunt them down and throw them in jail. So if you took the Supreme Court's logic, and if the Chinese were storing the data here in the United States, and a Chinese court went to Huawei and said, give us that data, we would have to turn over data from an American server to go help the Chinese suppress dissent. Doesn't sound like a really great plan. So this data localization stuff gets pretty complex pretty quickly. Nicole, there's another interesting question that's come in that says here, after reading Ted Koppel's Lights Out in 2015, which was a very good book by the former ABC correspondent about attacks on the electric utility grid, the panelist here says, or member of our audience says, I became concerned about our vulnerability to a cyber attack that would render one or more of the regional power grids inoperative for months. Since then, do you think we've taken significant steps to reduce this vulnerability? I would have argued until now, yes. I'd be interested to hear Nicole on this. But in Texas right now, we're seeing a case where you don't even need a hack to bring down the system. And you could imagine the kind of damage that could have been done there. Nicole, how do you assess the quality of the protections on the utility grid?
Well, what I remember most from Lights Out was Ted Koppel disclosed that when lawmakers tried to push for this bill that would mandate stricter security measures for the power grid and critical infrastructure, one of their findings in trying to convince their colleagues that this needed to pass was that if there was an attack on the American grid, it might be months, possibly longer, before we could get our power grid back to where it needed to be. That was not enough to convince lawmakers to pass the bill at the time. I do think we are in a better place than that in terms of our resiliency, because there has been so much more attention to these issues. Just with SolarWinds, one of the things we haven't discussed, and it's, we have to be careful not to overhype these attacks, but among the companies that used SolarWinds and among the companies Russia would have been able to get into are many American utility companies. And so while we do not think that was the end goal here, we don't think this was an attack designed to turn off the lights. It's still possible that Russia could use their access points into those systems to do so. And what I've gleaned from talking to some of the utility companies, which glom together in this thing called an ISAC, where they share threat data and information and how they're responding to some of these attacks, is that they are taking this very seriously. They are they ripped SolarWinds out of their networks. They are doing all of the things I suggested we do earlier, like take inventory of their software and understand how much of it is American made, and making sure that they do have multi-factor authentication turned on. So I do think we're in a better place than we were. That said, I don't worry about the PG&Es of the world. I think they do have complex security protocols in place. I worry about the small municipalities like Oldsmar, Florida, where they don't have the security budgets of a PG&E. They don't have, former NSA or CIA or even former Google engineers working on staff. They can't afford them. And so what they have to do is they have to rely on outside contractors to manage and supervise and in some cases secure their systems. And so they have to allow those outside contractors into their systems remotely. And that same access point can be exploited by hackers as it was in Oldsmar, Florida. So those are the ones that we have always worried about, these smaller municipalities. And I don't know if they are in any better place than they were,
Nicole,
8 years
we
ago.
only have a minute left, but when you and I were reporting a summer and a half ago, I guess 2 summers ago, about the ransomware on small Texas towns, I remember calling down to one and asking if I could talk to their head of cybersecurity, and the clerk who answered the phone said, "Head of cybersecurity?" He said, "We just got our first sheriff last year." So a last question, which I'm going to just answer in a sentence or two. How will the Biden administration handle response to nation state cyber attacks? And that really takes us back to where we started, which is SolarWinds. How President Biden, when he was still in the transition, said that he would make whoever did the SolarWinds attack pay a price. And now it's on him to show us what that price is and whether it's convincing. And that means they're going to have to do it very publicly. It's not something where you can just sort of quietly do it and say, well, we sent them a message. Because if you do it quietly, you sent a message to whoever received it, but you haven't sent a message to the rest of the world. And so this is one of those cases where I would argue the secrecy around cyber actually gets in the way of our own deterrence. Well, I want to thank you all for joining. I want to thank Nicole, my good friend, for doing this in the midst of her book tour and being willing to make us part of the book tour. I told her when she started the book tour that I was once told by Bob Schieffer, the CBS correspondent, who's a neighbor to me, that being on book tour is the only time where you actually get sick of the sound of your own voice. And she sent me a message the other day saying she had hit that point. But we weren't sick of it, Nicole. It was great to hear from you. And thank you, Philip, for and the Pacific Council and the World Affairs Councils for having us here today. And back to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Nicole Roth and David Sanger. We're so pleased that you could be with us today. I wanted to thank Pacific Council's Natasha Everhart for joining us. And I wanted to thank all of you who listened today. And I hope you enjoyed today's program. I just wanted to make it a special point that, to learn more, we encourage you to watch the HBO documentary, The Perfect Weapon, produced by David Sanger. And you can pick up Nicole Roth's new book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. Okay, so on behalf of World Affairs and the Pacific Council, have a great rest of the day. And in these still difficult times, please stay safe and be well. Take care.
Thank you so much, everyone.